We're live. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the sixth installment of the Communal Table Talks Food Hall Forward. I'm Carlo Maria Ciampoli, and I'm here with my co-hosts, Leslie Brenner and Bradford Thompson. And we have the great pleasure of having with us our special guest, Michael Morris. So today, we're going to be talking about food halls. This, beautiful unicorns that came online as an idea a few years ago, and just has been an upward trajectory until the world got upside down. And now things are, looking so much better. And we're here to discuss, where food halls are going and what things work, what things don't work. And there is no better person that speak about all those things than Michael. He's the CEO and founder of Cana Development. He has been ideating, designing, operating, managing food halls from for the past I think 14 years, something like that. I know, Michael, one thing that's kind of super interesting about you, that you have a degree in chemistry from Yale, which makes it like really kind of so interesting. Definitely, you are the man that can combine all the elements to create those connections between people, food, and places. So before we kind of jump into the discussion, as always, some kind of housekeeping for the people that are following us live. Please, if you have questions, there is a button right here that says "Ask Question" or in the chat. Please, this is a conversation, 30 minutes as always. So if you have something, please write it here, and we'll fold it into a conversation. I think, Michael, to me, one kind of great point of to kind of begin this talk is, can you give us a little bit of an outlook from kind of your point of view? You have obviously kind of really kind of wide perspective. What's going on in the food halls right now? As we were coming out of this pandemic, how things are looking for the food hall, and where are we going with them?
Sure, happy to. I mean, I think we're in an interesting time, right? Getting on the tail end, certainly there's light at the end of the tunnel of the last 18 months. I think it's still a tale of kind of two worlds in the U.S. particularly. We've seen a dynamically different shift south of really the Mason-Dixon line from north of the Mason-Dixon line, tied to the various restrictions that were put in place and how different municipalities treated those restrictions and removed them, and the timing of consumer confidence coming back, right? So, south of the Mason-Dixon has obviously rebounded faster, simply put. North of the Mason-Dixon still a little behind, although we're starting to see some real trajectory. And on a macroeconomic basis, there's going to end up being less competition, hopefully better labor. We'll see if that comes to fruition, and pent-up demand. By human nature, we are social creatures. And, the reality is the vast majority of the United States in particular, have been stuck at home over the last year or so. And I think we're all dying to get back out and socialize and interact and connect with others. And that's part of life. And, we're seeing in certain areas and markets where the restrictions have been removed earlier, particularly in the Southeast, in the Florida area, up to the Carolinas at the moment, that those markets are rebounding very quickly. In fact, we have certain tenants in our markets in Baltimore that have already achieved pre-COVID volume and or doing better, because not only have they learned how to operate, in a food hall environment, which they already knew, but they've become significantly more sophisticated as it relates to delivery and takeout and other things that can add to their business model. So I think we're pretty bullish. I mean, ultimately, the food hall model, I think, is as viable of an opportunity for any food and beverage operator that is out there. The barrier to entry, the cost to get involved is very nominal, particularly in second generation space. And the volumes and the sales coming out of the businesses are already there or rebounding, and they're easier to rebound, right? Because they're not reliant on people coming in and 200, 300, 400 in a 1 hour period as a restaurant would need in order to achieve their sales potential. So I think it's an exciting time. I think the proof will be in the pudding in the next year or so. I think in certain areas, particularly in the Northeast, it's still going to be 6 months to a year before we really see where things pan out. But South and Southeast, we're already seeing great signs. So we're pretty excited about it.
Michael, I'm curious. The whole COVID, the COVID part of the equation, of course, is super interesting in this moment to see, sort of how this all feels coming out of it. But I think we're also interested in, just sort of like in this, in the food hall, which has this obviously very long and ancient history, but in other ways, it feels like a new phenomenon. So in this sort of new phenomenon part of food hall history, which is to say, I don't know, what do we call that? The last 7 or 8 years. Like, what have we learned? Like, because it seems like, a few years ago, as people were opening these and creating them, it was like anything go, like it was the Wild West, and all kinds of different models for how they would be created were out there. And what have we learned? What have you learned about what works in terms of the way, in terms of kind of the organizational, the operational model, like how, just the kind of the basic frame of how it works, whether it's a patchwork of independence or whether it needs to be like really sort of controlled by, operations centralized. What have we learned since then?
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge is there's still a lot to learn, right? We're still infants, although to your point, I mean, the food hall public market industry, of which we're in both, and there is a dynamic difference, right, between a food hall and a public market, has existed since, the Roman Empire. The reality is there's definitely been an evolution in the last 10 years that have kind of put it at the forefront and made it a unique real estate and hospitality operation in a meaningful way. And I think it really speaks to kind of how people are looking to interact. The consumer is looking for an environment that's a create their own, and that they can go to by themselves, they can go to on a date, they can go to with 10 of their best friends. And everybody can create an experience that's commensurate with what they're specifically looking for. And it's vetoless, right? It doesn't matter if your dietary restrictions, your age, what kind of ethnic cuisine you're looking for. There should be something for everyone. And it's a create your own experience as far as both food as well as time, right? It's something if you wanted to run in and run out, or if you wanted to spend 3 hours hanging out, you could do all of those things. I think the couple of lessons learned, the major thing is that the groups that have attempted to operate the food hall in its entirety as one underlying operator, that's really tough to make work. And there are some examples of success, right? Italy is a perfect example of that. Those guys are world-class operators. They have a great model. I love it. And they've been successful. But there are a lot of other groups that have attempted to do that. And it's a huge undertaking, to take that amount of square footage and that amount of operations and labor and occupancy costs and rent and expense of capital of building the space out. You've got to get it all right. And, there's 1,000 dials that ultimately fall on one party if they're a single operator. And that's one of probably the most challenging models to execute on, for sure. And it's been one of the few models that's truly not worked because the scale requires a certain demographic, right? A certain number of people and a certain quality of that demographic in order to be successful. And the reality is there aren't that many markets in the United States and in the world that can support that scale. There are far more markets that don't have those demographics than there are that do have them. So again, it's not to knock the concept. I think it's a brilliant concept and well executed in the markets they're in. But we've seen that that's a challenge. I think we've also seen that, the markets that don't fulfill the direct needs of their in place consumer struggle, and there are great examples of very ethnic, Asian markets in Rockville Pike or Silver Spring in Maryland where there's a strong ethnic demographic, Asian demographic, and it's been wildly successful. There's been attempts to take similar type concepts and put them in demographics that those markets aren't there, and those have struggled for like reasons. It's not a one size fits all model. You can't copy and paste it. I think you have to be extremely thoughtful about the kit of parts and, you know, the merchandising and the brand and the individual vendors. And are you trying to be thematic? You know, I think the more thematic, the more singular operator driven concepts can be successful, but are the ones that are most susceptible to struggles if they don't get it perfectly right.
I'm curious, as a question, the food halls here in New York, we have quite a variety of styles, from smorgasbord to the urban spaces and smaller boutique ones. How important do you find alcohol to be in these spaces, as far as driving revenue and crowds at different day parts? And when there is alcohol, I know there's a couple different models, as far as who carries the liquor license and, sharing sales with all the vendors, or having a central bar or beer garden and then the food all around it. How important do you find the alcohol piece in driving the revenue in these? And what are the challenges with that?
Alcohol is extremely important to the success of any food hall. I mean, the reality is that, if you're looking to drive evening business or brunch business, without a liquor license, you're running a restaurant without ovens, right? I mean, the reality is just that it's an integral part of the overall experience. And the consumer, there's a portion of the population that just wants a beer with their burger. They just want a glass of wine with their slice of pizza. And if you can't provide that, they're going to find somewhere else that can. Similarly, by the way, look, food halls aren't the end all be all answer across the board. I mean, there are certain people and populations that, want to go out for dinner and they want to be served. They want a full service dining experience. But on the other hand, the liquor is a vital component to, I think, the success of a food hall. You can make a food hall work without a liquor license. That largely means that you're really driving a lunch traffic, right? You're driving a lunch trade. And there's examples of that working. But obviously you're rate limited, right? You're simply not going to do the total volume. You're not going to drive bodies into the building nights and weekends the way you would with a liquor license. From a structural perspective, as you pointed out, there's lots of different theories and operational kind of process. Ours is a blended approach. We believe very strongly that our food halls and markets should have a congregational kind of communal bar environment. That's a full service bar, meaning that there you can purchase beer, wine, or liquor. In some cases, we've separated those out a little bit. So like in Cross Street Market in Baltimore, as an example, we have one bar that's really focused on draft beer, and we have one bar that's really focused on craft cocktails and wine. They happen to be right next to each other. The craft cocktail and wine concept does sell beer, but very, very limited. The craft beer place does have cans of pre-made cocktails, but again, it's like 3 of them. It's very, very limited. And again, that's just to try to provide a more frictionless guest experience. From there, we sprinkle liquor throughout the market where applicable. And what I mean by that is, if we've got a burger concept, they might have 2 or 3 beers on draft, maybe a red wine, maybe a brown spirit, and that's it, right? Our sushi concept would have sake and maybe an Asian beer like a Sapporo or a Kirin Light, and maybe a Japanese whiskey, and that's it, right? Whereas our bakery concept probably isn't selling alcohol. Our florist is definitely not selling alcohol. Right. We want to create the most frictionless guest experience, and our data shows that ultimately that provides not only a better consumer experience, but better economic model for our vendors. The reality is that the average consumer isn't cross shopping for alcohol. So, I mean, just my own, experience as an example, I've got 3 kids. If I'm standing in front of the diner concept and I'm ordering burgers and I get cued correctly by the woman at the point of sale, the gentleman at the point of sale, and they say, "Hey, Mr. Morris, would you like a beer with your burger?" You got a 50-50 shot. Okay, maybe better than 50-50 that I say yes, right? If it's the right time, probably if it's evening. But I'm not leaving that line with my 3 kids and walking over to the bar and standing in another line to get a beer. Like, it's just not happening, right? Whereas if I'm going out with my friends and we're going out to grab a round of drinks, we're going to the bar. We're not going to the burger place to grab a beer necessarily. And we also do a bunch of things operationally to make that experience follow through. So, for example, we don't allow vendors to sell the same product. So if one group's selling Tito's vodka, they're the only group in the market selling Tito's. That does a couple of things. Number one, it eliminates cost cutting, right? So I can't try to grab a customer by saying, "Hey, come to my place because you can buy, fill in the blank, Bud Light for 50 cents less than my neighbor." It also, I think, aligns brands together and makes a more meaningful consumer experience. And I think the consumer is willing to understand that if they want a sake with their Italian pasta, maybe they need to wait in 2 lines. But on the flip side, they don't want to have to do that if they're, looking for a glass of Italian red with their slice of pizza.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think by doing it that way, it's the, rising tide raises all ships mentality. And, so far it's worked out quite well for us.
Interesting. And just as a follow-up, so with all the vendors providing their own, are they all carrying liquor licenses, or do you license the food hall under one license and they share in the liability or the insurance? How does that work?
Yeah, so all of our food halls run or operated under a singular liquor license. And that's done for a number of reasons. Operationally, that's done because it gives us more control as the operator about what our vendors are selling, and making sure that they're staying within kind of the guidelines that we've set out for them to abide by. It also makes sure that ultimately it allows us to have an open container, right? And in a lot of markets, municipalities, cities, despite the fact that it's interior space, if you are purchasing a product from a vendor, you legally couldn't take that into a common area seating area without the structure that we've put in place. There's a few cities where that's not the case. Washington, D.C., as an example, has a slightly different interpretation of that. But for the most part, that is how it works.
Michael, how do you think developers should think, like when you're working with a developer comes to you as a potential client or a client, like, and they ask you, do you think we should put a food hall in our project? How do you help them work through that? Like, just in terms of, is the food hall going to be a destination, or is it going to be really an amenity for office and residential? How do you help them think about that?
So the first thing, to point out is we say no a lot more than we say yes. And what we first ask them is what is their goal, right? Is their goal the amenitization of a surrounding asset? Is their goal a regional draw? Is their goal an economic one, or a combination of amenitization and economics? Because all of those play an important factor. And with the underlying asset that we're supporting, because most of our food halls, not all, but most of them are part of a mixed-use development, what is that use, and how does the food hall play into the overall community development and amenitization, experiential elements to the surrounding asset, and what are we leaning into? From there, in the beginning of our food hall development, which is over 10 years ago, we used a very sophisticated WAG theory of how we saw people coming into our markets, WAG being wild ass guess. We've been fortunate now, right? So we have 7 markets open and operating. We have 2 more about to open, one in Boston and one in Washington, D.C. By the way, I apologize, it's getting so dark, but we're about to get a storm, hence why it looks like I'm sitting, looks like I'm sitting in the dark, although I'm really not. So we look at that, and we've become, because of the scale of our operations, and because of the fact that we're in 7 different cities right now with over 180 vendors in our portfolio, we have access to point of sale systems. We have access to credit card data. We have access to cell phone information. We have access to demographic studies that we've done in all of our markets. So we can really look at what capture rates are, right? What is the reasonable expectation in a daytime population within a 5 to 7 minute walk? What's the reasonable expectation of a 10 to 15 minute drive time? And we can compare that to what we're literally seeing in our other markets, and use that as a filter to first say, okay, what is the landlord or client looking to achieve? What is the market support? What is also comparison of, we look at all the existing food and beverage that is in that surrounding submarket. How are those vendors doing? What are their check averages? What are their throughputs? And is there a there? Honestly, more often than not, one of those things doesn't align. We then take it to the next level, which is, okay, the physical space. And is the physical space able to support a food hall, right? Because the reality is, you're building A, the most expensive, and B, the most complicated part of a restaurant repetitively. And so in an average 10,000 square foot food hall, right, you're going to have roughly 7 to 8 vendors per 10,000 square feet, give or take. That means you're building 7 to 8 kitchens. And the physical space has to support the mechanical systems, the plumbing systems, the electrical requirements, which are all significantly more than a single restaurant of comparable size. And can it literally support that first? And then secondarily, can we afford it? Because it's not cheap. And lately, it's only getting more and more expensive. And so how does that all come together in a meaningful way? And then fulfilling, okay, now we understand what the goals are. We understand that the market has a certain support mechanism. We understand that the physical space can support it. We now can figure out the economic model, and does that work? And then the final question is, does the market have the vendors that can support fulfilling the space? Because oftentimes what we see is opportunities, particularly in tertiary markets, where all of the answers to those questions up to that last one have been yes. And then you look at the overall market size and you're like, there's simply just not enough food vendors in the surrounding community to really feel comfortable that this can be working long term, because we see turnover, right? And our average market sees very nominal turnover, but it's consistent. 90% of our vendors are successful, meaning only 10% of our vendors on a 12-month cycle tend to turn over. But that means in an average food hall, that means 1 a year, right? And on a 10-year cycle, if you've started with 7 to 8 and you're replacing 1 a year, that's 14 to 15 vendors in a 10-year cycle. And does the market have that in it? If all of those questions are yes, we typically are into something.
Hey, Michael, in terms of space and place, I mean, for me, kind of personally, the most kind of fulfilling food hall experiences are the one where there is an inside and outside. And definitely, through COVID, that proportion and the willingness of people to kind of eat outside, regardless if it's hot or cold, it really kind of changed. Do you see any shift in the kind of places that your clients are looking for, that maybe have like more outdoor space than before?
Yeah, I mean, look, the absolutely outdoor seating is as relevant today as ever, and is truly a differentiator. It's always been important, by the way. A good friend of ours and a tenant in one of our properties, Alex Smith, who operates Atlas Restaurant Group, would tell you that he won't sign on a lease where he can't seat the same number of people outside that he can seat inside, because you go through in every market shifts where regardless of how successful or how well operated or how good your food is, people want to sit outside, and particularly if it's connected to water. Water is a unifying body of life, right? And if you have a water view, or if you're close to the water, people want to innately sit near it or next to it.
Yeah.
And if you don't have outdoor seating in the months that people want to go outside, they're simply going to go to other places. So, you have to have that. And to make it a dynamic part of the overall experience and brand it in such a way that connects with the consumer in a meaningful way is, first of all, expensive. And second of all, has to be intentional. I can't tell you how many times, particularly recently, where we've seen outdoor space and seating, and people are like, well, we have outdoor seating. And we're like, you have folding tables and chairs. Like, that's not outdoor seating. It's not the same, right? And it's amazing to me how so many brands spend so much time, energy, and money in their design and finishes in the interior, and the exterior space is an afterthought. And it's a challenge, right? Because it's a seasonal business. It's weather reliant, but it has to, the groups that get it and truly thoughtfully design and execute it, I think will end up doing quite well, and that's not going to change anytime soon.
Fantastic. And one other thing that I'm really curious about is how about entertainment, the entertainment component? Is this something that you think it's kind of necessary, kind of 100% of the time, or what are your thoughts of live entertainment, at least a few days a week?
So, programming and activation is a vital component to a successful hospitality business. I think it's important that it is thoughtfully executed and that it is timed to support the overall business model, not to take over the business model or compete with it. Meaning that, we rarely run, major events on a Friday night. There's already people there, and most people want to be there at that time to engage and socialize. We tend to do our events Tuesday evenings, Monday nights, Saturday afternoons, and we look at a huge scale, right, of activations and programming. It's not just a live band. Art plays an integral role into it. Social gaming, right? Things like cornhole. We're running a cornhole league in Philadelphia that's been very successful. Pickleball. We're looking at adding pickleball courts to several of our properties right now. The arts play a role, as I mentioned earlier, both as a function of engagement, but also a function of activity, right? So paint night, perfect example. But also, unique artwork that draws people's attention, gives an Instagrammable moment is still, I think, something that's very unique. Cooking or hospitality-driven programming is interesting. We've also extended that, though, like in Philadelphia or Pittsburgh, as an example. We are underway, and we've just gotten approval and starting construction on a large outdoor playground as part of a overall redevelopment of Southside Works in Pittsburgh. And we've been working with REI, who is going to sponsor the playground. They've got a great store across the street, and they're going to actually use a portion of the playground area that we've designed to do demonstrations on camping and outdoor activities. They're also going to allow consumers, guests, to test drive their mountain bikes on the portion of the playground that we've designed for that. So it really creates, I think, a very unique, engaging combination. That's not just entertainment, but it's all about creating little different experiences and combining them in a unique way that become a destination, right? And the consumer right now is, every consumer at a certain level has attention deficit disorder. And I mean that in a nice way. Our attention is being pulled in way too many directions. A lot of it tied to social media, a lot of it tied to technology. And I think the more that we can find ways to grab their attention and to change habits, better establish our locations as destinations. And the challenge with that is we have to constantly stay both relevant, but also reliable, where the consumer knows that this is a place to come because there's going to be something to do, and it's going to be interesting and thoughtfully executed.
Well, fantastic. Michael, thank you very much for being part of this conversation, for sharing your knowledge, your experience. It's where, at the end of our half an hour, again, we love to keep it, short and sweet and, full of content. Again, thank you for being part of this. And thank you to everybody that's, connected. We'll take a little, pause in the summer for the month of August, but we'll be back in September. Have a great summer, everybody.
Have a good summer. Thank you, Michael. That was
awesome.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you all. Appreciate the opportunity. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.